Violent offenders walked out of an open prison on New Year's Day and just vanished. One is a convicted murderer, and the other has a history of serious violence.
The country ripped at the seams as fresh waves of arrivals kept coming, and people who felt forgotten finally poured into the streets. And what began as shouting soon became full-on clashes, where ordinary men and women pushed hard against the police lines until helmets bumped, helmets and shields groaned under the strain. And from the first moment, the mood was clear. This was not a march for speeches. This was a fight for space and voice. A raw, living shove at the system that felt like betrayal to anyone who had watched promises and budgets and years of talk slide by while their towns changed around them. Because in the eyes of the crowds, the slow hand of the state had been replaced by fast buses and closed doors. And when video showed coaches ferrying groups away from the shore into the heart of the nation, the anger flipped from general worry to furious shame. People shouting that their leaders had turned their backs while strangers were moved in under bright lights. The uproar landed like a cold slap in the face of the normal rhythm of life, the clatter of plates replaced by the constant drone of drones, and the sound of boots on pavement as police tried to carve a path through a sea of bodies. Pressure mounted on Keir Starmer like heat in a closed room. And inside the rooms, where maps and numbers were shown, the mood grew tense because time after time, the same scenes came in from every corner of the nation. Broken shutters, groups beating on fences, small gangs of people trying to push through security perimeters around hotels, and officers forming tight lines to hold them back. The kind of close contact that leaves both sides raw and angry, where a single misstep can topple a line and set off a wave that sweeps down a whole street. Aides said the Prime Minister had to pick his words with care. But words were not what the crowds wanted. What they wanted were visible changes, fast results. And when they did not get them, the name of the leader became a chorus in the streets, chanted hot and sharp, a target that carried months of worry inside it. And every time ministers spoke of compassion and process, the sound of that call from the crowd only grew louder, harder, angrier, until the situation felt like a test of whether a leader could still be trusted to keep order while staying human. Across the South Coast, the arrival points were scenes of tight conflict as border teams worked under pressure and villagers watched coaches pass in the night. And at the port near Dover, a long line of officials tried to move groups through processing lanes while people gathered at the barriers to shout and film as if to make the state see what it had not seen before, while in the wider county of Kent warned those calls would make things worse. And across the Atlantic, words from Donald Trump were replayed and used as proof that hard lines could work elsewhere. A comparison that inflamed passions and pushed some crowds to demand exactly that kind of force at home. Meanwhile, other voices pleaded for calm and for better planning. And in the gray hours of early morning, the debate turned to the practical. Where would new arrivals sleep? How long would they be processed? Who would pay for care and housing? And why had local councils not been warned in time? Because each unanswered question was a new spark, and every new conspiracy theory or shaky rumor that migrants were living comfortably while locals froze at home only widened the gap between people in the streets and the people in suits, making it harder to rebuild trust. As clashes continued, the emotional toll deepened, and the country began to feel the strain of constant confrontation, with emergency services stretched and communities split into camps that barely spoke the same language anymore, because the demonstrations were not a single event, but a series of standoffs that repeated across towns until people felt beaten down by the endless cycle of tension. A convoy arrives, people gather, clashes happen, police hold, the scene quiets. And then it starts again somewhere else, drawing in new faces and new anger. And the result was a long, grinding pressure on the whole system where the Prime Minister had to answer not just for a border problem, but for a breakdown of trust that made every street feel like a test of strength. In that climate, the name of Nigel Farage echoed in some crowds as a battle cry for action, while media lines debated what was lawful and what was necessary. And the constant presence of cameras meant each clash became part of the next day's fuel, a loop that fed itself until it felt like a fever that no single measure could cool, because policing alone could not answer the deeper fear, and yet without firm control, the clashes would not stop. By the time the sun tilted again, the maps had changed. Towns once calm marked with lines of disruption, bridges and main roads slowed to a crawl, and the pressure to act fell onto the leadership where inside corridors in Whitehall, ministers argued about the balance between compassion and order, about how to process people fairly while stopping the unrelenting flow that had turned public anger into physical clashes, and the Prime Minister found that every decision risked setting off another wave. Because to some, the only acceptable answer was immediate removal, and to others, it was humane processing and support. And stitching those things together was as hard as trying to mend a torn sail in a storm. The nation stood staring at a choice between two ugly paths, and until a plan appeared that both reassured the frightened and respected the rules, the streets would remain a place of conflict, loud with chants, bright with flares, swollen with bodies pushing against lines of helmets, a constant reminder that trust can be destroyed in small steps until one day it breaks and the whole place looks like a landscape returned from a fight, where the clashes leave behind more than just broken glass. They leave behind a harder, angrier people who have learned how to stand in the face of state power and demand to be seen. And that demand did not fade with daylight, it hardened. The following evening, the same streets filled again, faster this time, as if people had already decided that one night of confrontation was not enough to force change, and police commanders who hoped exhaustion would thin the crowds instead watched them grow thicker, louder, more organized, with groups arriving in waves and spreading out across junctions to stretch the lines thin, testing response times and pushing at weak points until officers were forced to redeploy in hurried formations, shields locking together while protesters pressed shoulder to shoulder in a solid wall of bodies that moved as one mass, chanting, clapping, stomping, the rhythm echoing off buildings like a drumbeat of defiance. In several flashpoints, the clashes became prolonged, shoving contests that lasted nearly an hour without pause. Neither side backing down, boots sliding on scattered debris as people lost footing and were dragged upright by strangers before being swallowed again by the surge. And when officers attempted to clear space with controlled forward drives, the crowd would split and reform behind them, creating a constant ring of confrontation that left everyone breathless and soaked in sweat despite the cold night air. Rumors that more migrants were being relocated inland spread quickly and reignited anger near transport routes, where small groups attempted to block buses by sitting in the road until police lifted them away one by one, a slow, tense process that drew loud jeers and fresh pushing from those standing behind, turning each removal into another spark for confrontation. And though no firearms were drawn and no lethal force used, the intensity of the physical clashes was undeniable. Arms locked, helmets jolted, bodies slamming into shields with dull thuds that carried down the street, the kind of raw contact that leaves bruises and resentment long after the sirens fade. In some districts, officers were forced into tactical retreats to avoid being surrounded, stepping back in disciplined lines while protesters surged forward cheering, only to be met by fresh reinforcements arriving from side roads, creating a back-and-forth struggle that felt less like crowd control and more like contested ground shifting by meters at a time. Inside government offices, the reports grew more urgent, describing not just unrest but sustained confrontation, a pattern repeating nightly with no sign of natural burnout, and advisors warned that each clash further eroded public trust, deepening the divide between communities and leadership, while international media replayed the scenes as evidence of a nation under strain. The Prime Minister faced a tightening circle of pressure, knowing that too soft a response risked emboldening the crowds, while too hard a response could inflame them further, and that narrow space for balance seemed to shrink with every new video showing another shield wall buckling under the force of determined citizens who believed they had nothing left to lose by standing their ground. As the third night approached, shopkeepers boarded windows in advance, and residents stocked supplies in case roads closed again, the entire rhythm of daily life bending around the expectation of fresh clashes. And in that heavy pause before darkness fell, the country held its breath, aware that the next surge of bodies against police lines might not just be another protest, but the moment that defines how far this crisis can stretch before something finally gives.